Hallo zusammen, ich bin Eva Carter und heute begeben wir uns auf eine Reise in eines der düstersten und faszinierendsten Kapitel der Geschichte, nach London im Jahre 1665. Eine Stadt, die sich in nur einem Jahr von einer blühenden Metropole in einen Ort des unermesslichen Kummers verwandelte. Alles begann mit einer tiefen Unruhe, die schon ein Jahr vor der eigentlichen Katastrophe über der Stadt schwebte. Der Ausbruch von 1665 war für die abergläubischen Londoner kein Zufall. Der Himmel selbst sandte ihnen ein furchterregendes Zeichen. Im Winter 1664 raste ein Komet über die Welt, den die Astrologen jener Zeit einstimmig als Vorboten großen Unheils bezeichneten. In jenen Jahrhunderten glaubten die Menschen fest daran, dass Himmelskörper das Schicksal diktierten, und sie erwarteten für das kommende Jahr nur die schwersten Prüfungen. Obwohl seit der ersten verheerenden Welle des großen Leidens im 14. Jahrhundert mehr als 300 Jahre vergangen waren, kehrte es immer wieder zurück und suchte gelegentlich Städte in ganz Europa heim. Doch es war das Jahr 1665, das alle bisherigen Rekorde an Verlusten in der Hauptstadt der britischen Inseln brach. Zuvor galt das Jahr 1625 als die schwerste Zeit, als etwa 40.000 Menschen bei einer Bevölkerung von 200.000 ihr Leben ließen. Blickt man weiter zurück in die Geschichte, so beliefen sich die Verluste Londons beim ersten Auftreten der Infektion in Europa über den Hafen von Messina auf etwa 30.000 Menschen bei 70.000 Einwohnern. Doch in jener schicksalhaften Zeit, über die wir heute sprechen, forderte die Krankheit das Leben von etwa 100.000 Londonern. Es ist wichtig zu bedenken, dass die Gesamtbevölkerung der Hauptstadt damals etwa 385.000 Menschen betrug. Dies sind nur ungefähre Zahlen, da ein vollständiges System zur Erfassung der Bevölkerung damals noch in den Kinderschuhen steckte. Freunde, wenn ihr an diesen historischen Untersuchungen interessiert seid, abonniert unbedingt den Kanal und hinterlasst jetzt ein Like. Das hilft mir sehr, noch bessere Inhalte für euch zu erstellen. Aber glaubten die Menschen nur an die Sterne? Während die Bürger ängstlich in den Nachthimmel blickten, bröckelten die Fundamente der Zukunft bereits langsam unter ihren Füßen. Für uns, die Menschen des 21. Jahrhunderts, erscheinen die Gründe für das kommende Chaos recht bodenständig und verständlich. Während einige auf den Schweif des Kometen starrten, wurde die Stadt selbst zu einer perfekten Falle, in der jede Gasse und jedes Haus den Boden für ein unvermeidliches Ende bereitete. Die wahre Bedrohung verbarg sich nicht im Weltraum, sondern im täglichen Leben einer rasant wachsenden Metropole, die an ihren eigenen Abfällen und der Überfüllung erstickte. Der Feind war zu klein, um bemerkt zu werden, aber stark genug, um ein ganzes Land in die Knie zu zwingen. Steigen wir vom Himmel herab in die schmutzigen Straßen des Londons des 17. Jahrhunderts, die damals eine ideale Umgebung für die Verbreitung jeder Infektion darstellten. Eines der Hauptprobleme der boomenden Stadt war eine fast völlig fehlende Kanalisation. Die Bevölkerung der Hauptstadt wuchs jedes Jahr an und erreichte bis zur Mitte des Jahrhunderts fast 400.000 Menschen. Um das Ausmaß des Problems zu verstehen, genügt der Hinweis, dass das moderne Entsorgungssystem, das heute in London verwendet wird, erst Mitte des 19. Jahrhunderts eingeführt wurde. Dies geschah nach dem berüchtigten Ereignis, das als der große Gestank in die Geschichte einging, als das Atmen in der Stadt absolut unmöglich wurde.
In the 17th century, however, there was almost no talk of hygiene. All household waste, food scraps, and fish remains were simply thrown onto the streets. This filth either flowed down the gutters right through the streets or rotted in haphazardly located cesspits. Such crowding and lack of sanitation created fertile ground for any disaster. The saddest part was that in England at that time, no one had the slightest idea that the cause of the tragedy was a tiny bacterium invisible to the eye. This microorganism was only discovered at the end of the 19th century by a French-Swiss scientist named Alexander Yersin and was named in his honor. To the simple-minded Londoners, and most people on the planet, the condition seemed not to be a disease transmitted by insect bites, but a divine punishment for sins, a consequence of bad weather, or the influence of that very comet. Many believed in the theory of miasmas, which claimed that infection occurred by inhaling foul odors. Londoners blamed the heavy stench that enveloped the city, and in a way, they were right, as the cleanliness of the air directly depended on the cleanliness of the streets. But the real enemy was so small that it could not be seen for another 200 years. And this invisible opponent had already begun its hunt, using those who lived side by side with people in every basement and attic as its transport. While the townspeople tried to fight the smells, the true threat was rapidly spreading through the city slums, preparing for a decisive strike. The mechanics of how this illness spread resemble a true biological thriller. The main culprit was the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which used tiny insects as its carriers. On its own, a common flea is not very dangerous until it becomes infected. Once inside the insect, the bacteria begin to multiply rapidly and literally block its digestive tract. As a result, the unfortunate creature can no longer feed normally. Feeling unbearable hunger, the flea becomes extremely aggressive and begins to bite every living thing around it, from small rodents to humans. Because its stomach is clogged with bacteria, with every new bite, it involuntarily injects the contents of its esophagus into the body of a new victim. Thus, the invisible enemy moves into a more spacious apartment, into the bodies of the city's inhabitants. Inside the human body, the bacteria behave like ruthless invaders. Carried by the bloodstream, they travel from one organ to another until they reach the lymphatic system. The lymph nodes respond to the attack with severe inflammation and enlargement, turning into painful lumps. It is because of these formations that the disease received its terrifying name. Over time, an even more dangerous form developed, transmitted by airborne droplets, where it was enough to simply be near an infected person to catch the illness. Unfortunately, 17th century Londoners made a fatal mistake in searching for the guilty. Believing that domestic animals were the carriers of the disease, the authorities issued a decree to exterminate cats and dogs. Tens of thousands of four-legged companions were destroyed, which was a true gift to the real culprits of the catastrophe, the rats. These rodents were the primary transport for the infected insects. Left without their natural enemies, the city's rat population began to grow exponentially, feeling like the rightful masters of the streets. The first cases were recorded during the winter in the port areas and a place called St. Giles. By April, the number of people who had passed away reached 400, but these were only incomplete records. Many families hid the truth until the very last moment, bribing officials or inventing other causes for what happened. People did this not out of malice, but because of a paralyzing fear of what would follow an official recognition of the illness. When the first victims began to fall in the port areas, the authorities finally took strict measures. But these measures turned ordinary London homes into true prisons, with no way out for many. As soon as a person whose days were numbered due to the illness was discovered in a family, a large red cross was painted on the door of the house. Often, An inscription was added beneath this sign: "Lord, have mercy upon us," or "God, preserve our souls." This meant that the entire family, regardless of the health of the other household members, was placed under a strict quarantine for a period of 40 days. The word quarantine itself comes from an Italian expression meaning exactly that period of time. For most 17th century Londoners, such a decision by the authorities effectively became a final sentence. People found themselves locked in cramped and stifling rooms, often without enough food or water. If anyone in the family was still healthy, infection became only a matter of time in such conditions. Supervision of this isolation was entrusted to special guards from the lower classes, who were paid a very good wage for the time. They ensured that no one left the locked dwellings, and sometimes acted with extreme cruelty. Even higher were the earnings of those engaged in collecting the bodies of the departed. Every night, wagons passed through the dark and ominous streets, and the silence was broken only by the cries of the drivers. "Bring out your dead!" The bodies were collected directly from the houses and taken to mass graves, which filled up quickly. Eyewitnesses recalled that an unbearable stench hung over the city, and the church bells announcing every new loss rang so often that at one point it was decided to stop them. The mechanism simply could not handle the load. In the northern part of the city, at the sites of current subway stations and modern streets, mass burials from that period are still found today. The ground level in old church cemeteries sometimes rose 1.5 meters higher than the entrance to the building, specifically because of the enormous number of people who left this world within a single year. The wealthy classes, including the Lord Mayor and King Charles II, had the opportunity to leave the capital, although some officials remained at their posts, trying to maintain some semblance of order in the chaos. However, most Londoners had no choice. They remained in the panic-stricken metropolis, where the only law was fear. In this chaos of despair, people sought salvation in the most desperate things. Religion, superstition, and folk medicine mixed into one volatile cocktail. When traditional prayers stopped bringing relief, the townspeople began to believe in the most incredible methods of protection. You won't believe what was considered an effective remedy at that time, and the extremes people went to in order to cheat their inevitable end. Distorted rumors and pseudo-scientific theories gave rise to treatment methods that today seem not just strange, but truly frightening. In this chaos of despair, people sought salvation in the most desperate things, and the medicine of the time offered methods that today seem like a true nightmare. Through the streets gripped by the illness walked the so-called plague doctors, whose appearance inspired superstitious terror. They wore long leather coats and masks with huge bird-like beaks. This costume was designed in the 16th century by the French physician Charles Delorme to protect against infection. Fragrant herbs soaked in honey or vinegar were stuffed into the beak of the mask, as doctors believed that the infection was transmitted exclusively through foul odors. Although this theory was incorrect, the thick clothing and masks did give the medics at least some chance of avoiding direct contact with the sick. Attempts at treatment often turned out to be more painful than the illness itself. Physicians frequently cauterized inflamed lymph nodes with red-hot iron, hoping to destroy the infection inside the body. Unfortunately, such procedures only put the doctors at great risk and brought the patients unbearable suffering, having almost no effect on the outcome. But even stranger were the folk methods of prevention. In the London of that time, people seriously believed that smoking tobacco could save them from infection. It was thought that the smoke purified the lungs and drove away the invisible threat, so even small children were forced to smoke. But the most shocking myth was the legend that having another serious condition could act as a kind of shield. People heard stories that those already suffering from chronic intimacy-related illnesses were supposedly not susceptible to the new plague. In hopes of surviving, some townspeople intentionally sought out intimacy with the infected in back alleys, trying to trade one illness for protection from another. Of course, this was just a cruel joke or someone's delusion with no scientific basis, but it clearly shows the level of desperation reached by the city's residents. By September of 1665, the situation reached its peak. In just 1 week, about 7,000 cases of people departing this world were recorded in the city. It seemed that London was doomed to total extinction, and the familiar world was finally collapsing. However, nature and chance prepared an unexpected finale for this tragedy. When summer ended and the cold weather arrived, the activity of the carriers began to decline naturally, and following the frosts came another element. Ironically, what was initially perceived as a new catastrophe became a cleansing fire for the exhausted city. A massive fire that swept through the capital the following year put a symbolic end to the history of the Great Illness, literally burning away the traces of the disease along with the old wooden buildings. By the winter of 1665, the illness began to gradually recede, as the carriers of the infection do not handle the cold well. By February of 1666, King Charles II returned to the capital along with his large entourage, and the rest of the citizens followed him, believing that the danger had passed. However, the final point in this tragic story was set in September of 1666, when the Great Fire broke out in London. The enormous blaze destroyed a significant part of the city, but along with the dilapidated wooden buildings, those who contributed to the spread of the disease also perished in the fire. Although many lost their homes, optimists of the time believed that the disaster had cleansed the city of the last traces of the infection. If we look at the figures from that time, official records noted about 68,596 people who left this world. However, contemporaries and later researchers themselves considered these data to be incomplete. Today, historians suggest that the true number of victims was between 100,000 and 200,000 people, which was a colossal loss for a city with a population of less than 400,000. The true cause of this catastrophe remained a mystery for another 2 centuries, until in 1894, the scientist Alexander Yersin discovered the very invisible bacterium that for centuries had held entire continents in fear. Thanks to this discovery and the subsequent invention of antibiotics, the illness ceased to be a global threat. Today, the risk of an unfavorable outcome with timely treatment is only about 10 to 15%. Looking at the events of the past from the 21st century, one begins to have a special respect for the work of medical professionals and to value the incredible progress that science has made. If not for modern knowledge, many of us might not be here today. Thank you for walking this difficult historical path with me. I hope this story has made you appreciate the safety and achievements of our time even more. Take care of yourselves and your health. If you found this interesting, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new investigations. Also, be sure to watch my 2 other videos that have just appeared on your screen. They are just as fascinating and will help you dive even deeper into the secrets of the past. Until next time, I'm Eva Carter.